cold wind swept through the city streets, carrying the scent of damp concrete and the distant aroma of food from a nearby vendor. Under the flickering glow of a street lamp, a man sat cross-legged on a worn-out blanket, his layered clothes doing little to shield him from the chill. Beside him, a bundle of belongings wrapped in a tattered sheet served as his only possession in the world. His name was Elliot. Once he had a home, a job, and dreams that stretched beyond the city's skyline. Now, he had only the streets and the kindness of strangers who sometimes dropped a few coins into the empty cup beside him. Yet, through it all, he carried an unyielding spirit, refusing to let circumstances dictate his heart. That night, Elliot managed to gather enough change for a modest meal. With careful hands, he unwrapped a steaming loaf of bread and a small piece of roasted meat. His stomach growled in protest, but just as he was about to take his first bite, he noticed a pair of golden eyes watching him from the shadows. A dog, thin, shivering, and with patches of fur missing, stood a few feet away. Its ears were pinned back, its tail low, but its eyes held a mixture of hope and caution. Elliot exhaled, feeling an unexpected warmth bloom in his chest. He knew hunger well, knew the ache of an empty stomach, the gnawing pain that made even stale bread feel like a feast. Without hesitation, he tore the bread in half and tossed a portion toward the dog. The creature flinched but didn't run. It eyed him warily before inching closer, sniffing at the food before snatching it up with quick movements. Elliot smiled, watching the dog devour the morsel. And then he broke off a piece of meat, placing it on the ground before leaning back against the brick wall. As the night deepened, the dog stayed. It watched Elliot with cautious curiosity, and after a while, it crept forward and curled up near his feet. Elliot chuckled, reaching out a tentative hand. The dog flinched at first, but then allowed the touch, pressing its cold nose against his palm. From that night on, they were inseparable. The dog, whom Elliot named Rusty, followed him wherever he went. They shared meals, warmth, and a companionship neither had known for a long time. Rusty, once fearful and frail, began to regain his strength. His fur thickened, his ribs became less pronounced, and his eyes gleamed with something close to trust. Days turned into weeks, and as winter tightened its grip on the city, Elliot faced harsher conditions. Some nights were unbearable, the cold seeping into his bones despite the layers he wrapped around himself. But Rusty never left his side. The dog would press against him, his warmth a small but significant shield against the freezing air. One particularly frigid evening, Elliot woke to find Rusty nudging his hand, whining softly. Drowsiness clung to him, but he noticed something unusual. Rusty was restless, his body tense. Then he heard it. The sound of approaching footsteps, heavy and purposeful. Before he could react, a voice cut through the darkness. "Hey, you all right?" A man in a thick coat stood before him, a concerned expression on his face. He carried a thermos, steam curling from its open lid. The scent of hot coffee reached Elliot's nose, making his stomach twist with longing. "You don't look so good," the stranger continued. "Come on, there's a shelter not far from here. They have beds, warm food. You don't have to be out in this cold." Elliot hesitated, his gaze flickering to Rusty. He had tried before. Shelters had rules, and many didn't allow animals. The thought of leaving Rusty behind was unbearable. The man seemed to understand. "You can bring him." Something inside Elliot shifted. He looked at Rusty, whose tail wagged slightly, then back at the stranger. With effort, he pushed himself up, his limbs stiff from the cold. The stranger helped him, guiding him toward a place Elliot hadn't dared to hope for. The shelter was warm, filled with the murmur of voices and the clatter of utensils against plates. A volunteer handed him a bowl of soup, and Rusty was given a dish of food as well. As he took his first sip, warmth spread through him. Not just from the meal, but from the kindness he had almost forgotten existed. Days passed, and Elliot found himself regaining strength. With Rusty by his side, he accepted small tasks at the shelter: cleaning, organizing donations, helping newcomers find a place to rest. His spirit, once worn and frayed, began to mend. One morning, as he was sweeping the entrance, a woman approached him. She held a folder in her hands, her eyes kind but serious. "Elliot," she said, "we've found something for you." Inside the folder was a job listing, nothing extravagant, just a position at a local warehouse. But it was steady work, a chance to rebuild. He looked down at Rusty, who wagged his tail and made his decision. Months later, Elliot stood outside a small apartment, the key to his new home resting in his palm. Rusty sat beside him, his fur sleek and his eyes full of life. With a deep breath, Elliot unlocked the door and stepped inside. It wasn't much, but it was warm, safe, a place to start anew. As he knelt down, Rusty licked his face, his tail thumping against the floor. Elliot laughed, wrapping his arms around the dog that had saved him as much as he had saved it. As the days passed in his new home, Elliot began thinking about the people he had left behind on the streets, those still struggling to survive, just as he had. One afternoon, he gathered a few extra meals from the shelter and walked back to the places he once called home. He found an old friend, Marcus, huddled in an alleyway, shivering. Without hesitation, Elliot sat beside him, sharing a meal, just as he had with Rusty that fateful night. Rusty, ever the companion, wagged his tail and nuzzled against Marcus. Something about the dog's warmth, the simple act of sharing, brought a flicker of light into Marcus's weary eyes. Elliot promised to return, to help in any way he could. Weeks later, with the help of the shelter's outreach program, Elliot convinced Marcus to come with him. A cycle of kindness had begun, one that started with a shared meal between a man and a dog, and had now reached another soul in need. Elliot's life continued to improve. His job became more stable, and his relationships within the community grew stronger. Rusty became a beloved presence at the shelter, a symbol of resilience and companionship. Elliot started volunteering more frequently, helping others find the same path he had walked. Hope had found him in the most unexpected way, and now he passed it on. Because in a world that often turned cold, the warmth of compassion had the power to change everything.